Okay, so we were talking about this image, and we talked about uh, three editing tools: correcting lens corrections, and then doing auto white balance, and then we were talking about exposure. By the way, we skipped these two. If you want to manually adjust white balance of your images, you can use these two sliders. Very simple to use. If you look at the shade of the slider, if you move this slider towards left, it gives you a more cold look. And if you move to right, it gives you warmer look. So you can adjust these two according to your choice. Most of the time, auto works for most of the images. And I prefer natural colors, so auto is good enough for me. We were talking about exposure, the first slider in the second section. Exposure is very simple control, which mainly adjusts overall lighting of the image. If you move it towards right, it adds more light to the image. And when I say more light to the image, overall image, okay? If you move this slider to the left, it takes away some light from the image. And I was telling that if you are using DSLR cameras and if you adjust your aperture and all that stuff, it's precisely the same, except that it will not change depth of field, but it will change exposure of the image. So if you notice, I have changed the exposure of this image to minus 0.6, which means less than one f-stop. Contrast is very, I think all of us understand, if you move this slider towards right, it increases the contrast, which means it makes dark things darker and bright things more bright. And if you move it towards left, it does the reverse, which means it tries to make brighter images less bright and darker images less dark. So it's a choice that you want to, I mean, it's your choice. What do you like and what do you like in that particular photograph? I'm not changing contrast for this image for now. I may change that later on. Next slider is highlights. Highlights is basically a control which doesn't impact all the pixels in your image, but the brighter pixels. So let's see what it does. So if I move this slider to left, you see the brightness of the bird and this water container is changing, but it's not majorly changing whole image at same, I would say, at same rate, right? And if you move this sliders towards right, it makes those brighter pixels bright, but it's not touching the shadows. Like if you look at these, it's not really adding any brightness to these areas. So this basically works only on highlights of the image. Highlights are areas which are more brighter in a simple form, if I have to put it. By the way, these controls are a little more technical, and I would say there are more fine details behind them. I'm not going into that because that will be impossible to cover in this time. Shadows is exactly opposite. It will work only in shadow area. So if you move the slider towards left, it will intense your shadows. So if you look at this background, this is becoming darker. If you move this towards right, it will bring some details back. So in this image, I would want to make shadows darker. Okay. Now whites. Whites is basically extreme bright part of the image. Let's see what it does. So if you notice, it's as I move it towards right, it's changing this part of the bottle more than this part. So whites, what's the difference between whites and highlights, by the way? So whites are brightest portions of the image. Highlights are any other bright areas except the top 20% of the bright pixels. That's how it works. The more you play with these controls, you'll get to know, in sense, what to expect out of them, and what part of the image will be impacted by one control or the other control. Similarly, blacks. So shadow and blacks. So extreme shadows are actually blacks. Let's see what it does. So if I move it towards left, it'll make darker things even dark, right? So, and the intensity of that darkness is much higher than what you get in shadows. Okay. So if you notice, I get, like in this image, when I'm moving this black, it's sort of changing the same shadow area, but with very high intensity of blacks. If I do it reverse way, it'll sort of bring back the details or that green color. I like blacks more, they highlight the subject. So in this case, if I do this, this basically makes a viewer focus more on the bird and not in the background, which was green earlier. So I sort of want more blacks here. Okay. So these 6 are, I would say, very fundamental controls, very important controls, and most of the times you get very good images by just using these 6. Let's see what all we have achieved so far in this image. So this is the difference that we have achieved so far, and I would say it's pretty. I mean, it's quite impactful just by moving 4 or 5 sliders in few minutes. Right now I'm explaining to you, so taking more time, but it's a job of few seconds. So you just need to adjust, and with practice it becomes even more easy, because you get a sense, okay, which control would give me what kind of results, and then you get better in terms of precision you can achieve with these sliders in your image. Okay, let me get back to single view mode. By the way, if you notice, these are views that you can get in develop. This is side by side, which means this is original image on the left, and this is edited image. And I'm going back to the latest version, which is here. If you want to look at the history on the left hand side, you can go to different different stages of this image. So you can choose between you can click on different stages, and that's how your image will be shown in the center part. I'm going back to the latest version. Okay. Now, clarity. So clarity is basically it gives if you move clarity towards the right, it enhances some of the broader edges of the image. Now, what does that mean? If you look at this change, you will say, oh, image is looking sharper. But it looks sharper, but at times it gives a very bad, I would say, look to the image as well. It starts looking very rough. So for example, this white branch in the background is now looking very, very prominent as I moved clarity to the right. Earlier it was not that, right? So you want to be careful when you're using this slider. Personally, I avoid using it. There are some exceptions. In case of flowers and kids photography, I tend to reduce clarity, which gives a very good dreamy effect to the images. But again, I would say be careful about this, about using this slider. If you're not comfortable, not use it, because it may it may basically distort your image if you don't use it carefully. I'll not go to dehaze right now. We'll go to saturation and vibrance. Very easy tools. Saturation is basically, it's the how you want to show colors in your image. If you want to enhance those colors, you tend to increase saturation. So if I'm moving sliders towards right, you see that colors are becoming richer. If I move it towards left, they are getting dull. And if I take to extreme, it becomes black and white. So you can play with it and see what kind of colors you want. Vibrance is basically, it changes colors, but it mainly adjusts some of the prime bright colors of the image. It will not change every color of the image. So if you notice in this case, probably there are more brighter colors. That's why probably it's hard to distinguish, but there's a fundamental difference between vibrance and saturation, that saturation works on all the colors with equal intensity, while vibrance works on some of the key bright colors of the image. Okay. So this, by the way, these are the controls I was saying that you'll see all these controls in almost all the apps. So if you understand them better and if you know how to use them, that can improve your images dramatically, and you may not need to spend a lot of time in other controls available in these softwares. Now, one important thing in editing is that whenever you play with one slider, it not only changes that particular aspect of the image, but it changes other things as well. So what do I mean by that? If you're changing, for example, contrast of the image, you would notice colors of the image also change. So when you edit your images, a combination of changes produce final result. None of these sliders work independently on the image, which means whenever you're using one slider after other, you want to be careful about what kind of changes you are seeing. Are you happy about them, or you want to change them, or and all that stuff. So by the way, whatever I said in the last, it may be confusing. So if you understood, fine. If you didn't understand that, ignore it. The more you will play with the editing, you will understand what I was trying to say. And there are some finer nuances behind it, which will be hard for me to cover in this session. Now, let's go to, so now in this image, I'm not liking that this bottle or water container is taking a little more attention than bird. Like the space it is taking in the image, and it's brighter, so it's taking more space. So what I want to do is I want to make it dull, but how do I do it? So there is a control on the top. It's called gradient tool. So I select this one. I create a gradient around this water container, ensuring that I'm not covering the bird. And now what I would do is I will reduce the exposure. Now what it is doing is it's basically only changing things in this part of the image and not this part of the image. So you have a control in terms of you can do some sort of selective editing in Lightroom. By the way, from selective editing, one thing which I want to share is that Lightroom will give you negligible options or very few options to manipulate an image. Because in Photoshop, you can do a lot of cut, copy paste in terms of you can cut this bird, you can add something else and all that. In Lightroom, you will not have those things, because Lightroom, as I said, is purely about processing your images, which means the details that you have in a clicked photograph, you can adjust colors, brightness, contrast kind of things in the image, but you will not be able to say add another bird to this photo. No, that's not the use case of Lightroom. If you want to do something like that, Photoshop is an answer for that. Okay, I'll stop here and see if there are any questions so far. Okay, if there are no questions, how to ensure aspect ratio? Probably you can unmute yourself and ask your question, because probably you may want to elaborate it a little. Oh, while cropping. Okay, so, okay, let me share my screen again and show that. So when you are in crop tool, there are aspect ratios in a drop down. So you can sort of select these options, And if you want to say original, this is the original. And now, you know, if you want to keep it as original aspect ratio, it will not allow you to distort that. So you can very well do it. Uh, uh, Hope that answers your question. So here is a drop down that helps you do that. Any other questions?